Finally, and it would appear somewhat reluctantly, as a result of the mass public protests in Australia and an obvious groundswell of public opinion, the Australian government has joined the 147 other United Nations countries and finally agreed to recognise a Palestinian state. This, of course, drew the ire of the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who described Australia's Prime Minister Albanese as a weak man. Whereupon Prime Minister Albanese took strong and decisive action and expelled the Iranian ambassador to Australia, prompting Tehran to comment that Prime Minister Albanese was a weak man. So this week, no pun intended, we're going to discuss what it actually means to be weak and just who really is weak. I'm Bintang Bernie, and this is Friday News Review. So, welcome to Friday News Review for the 29th of August. And weakness, what is it? I often think back to when Neville Chamberlain tried to appease Hitler and how that was portrayed as weakness, and what a terrible thing that was. Now, as always, I talk about the intent, not the outcome. Sure, it didn't work, but his intent was to avoid a massive war. His intent was to avoid a worldwide conflict. And when we finally did stand up to Hitler, it resulted in the death of 85 million people. So it didn't necessarily work out too good. However, I'm not saying we should have allowed Hitler to carry on building gas chambers everywhere. He ultimately had to be stopped. But what I'm saying is the perception of trying to avoid conflict is seen as a weakness, is seen as a negative. If you even look at the recent conference in Alaska between Trump and Putin, Trump was portrayed as weak. Apparently Putin walked all over him, played him like a violin. All, of course, statements made by people who weren't there, which I always find fascinating. These people seem to have this telekinetic ability to understand what's going on in a top secret conference. However, wouldn't it be considered a good thing that the leaders of the two large superpowers, the two men who possess between them the largest nuclear arsenals in the world and hold the fate of the entire civilization in their hands, wouldn't it be considered a good thing that they're talking to each other? I would think so. I wouldn't think that that's weak to go and talk to anyone. And yet it's perceived as a weakness. Trump was perceived as weak. I mean, they were meeting once and for all to try and stop a war. Now, admittedly, they didn't achieve much, but at least the intent was to try and stop a war. Why is that weak? Why is that a negative? Quite interesting, isn't it? Now, of course, coming back to Australia, to our Prime Minister, who immediately, on the advice of Mike Burgess, the $600,000 a year man whose wife holds an Israeli passport, the head of ASIO has apparently credible information which the Jerusalem Post is openly saying they were tipped off by the Israelis and the Israeli intelligence community, a known source of lies, manipulation, and complete untruths. And as a result of this, the Australian Prime Minister kicked out the Iranian ambassador because apparently in Iran, the Ayatollah is sitting there poring over maps of Bondi, working out which fish and chip cafe to get his minions to go and spray swastikas on. I mean, I can't say it without laughing. It is so Orwellian in its disbelief, its clear, blatant, it's childish in its intent, that the Iranians are trying to spray synagogues, light the odd fire here. I mean, for a start, there is no anti-Semitism in this country. There are people who are protesting the genocide in Gaza, but no one's been hurt, no one's been killed, all of which, thankfully, I'm glad to say. a little fire put here and there, tiny little bit of damage, and what is nothing more than graffiti. It's not anti-Semitism, just graffiti, okay? And it's achieved its aim of providing, I believe, an extra $30 million in funding to the Jewish community. Well, geez, I think that would be Iran's objective, wouldn't it? That's what they're trying to do. Or is it just possible that all of this is false flagging by a nation known for its false flags, such as beheaded babies, such as mass rapes, such as Hamas operatives in UNRWA? So I would say on this occasion, when we're talking about weakness, I'd have to say, for the first time and hopefully the only time in my life, I'll agree with Benjamin Netanyahu that Anthony Albanese is a weak man, because clearly he's being manipulated by geopolitics. Israel and America are gearing up for a war on Iran, or for further strikes on Iran, and this is a way of, engendering hatred in our populace. The same's happened in the UK. Apparently, there's evidence that Iranian operatives were going to stage some kind of mass terror attack in the UK. Of course, it never did and never will happen, but all we need is the evidence, which of course you and I can never see because it's classified. We have to trust our government, and we have to believe that what they're telling us is the truth. And if you believe any of this, well, then your head buttons up the back, I'm afraid to tell you. But I would say, in acting in such a rash and stupid way, the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, I would have to say, from my perspective, is weak. He's a weak and insipid man. The young, feisty parliamentarian who came into government speaking out on behalf of Palestine has withered into an old, frail man blowing with the wind. And so is his cabinet. Penny Never Wong, jumping on the bandwagon, condemning Iran. It's interesting, that this woman, I've got to hand it to Penny. She's quick to act. When the Israelis told her that UNRWA had Hamas operatives working for it, she immediately suspended funding without an investigation, without any due process. When Maren Faruqi held up a simple sign in the Senate condemning Israel, she immediately suspended her. And now she's immediately agreed to, send the Iranian ambassador to Australia packing. So I guess you could say, is she weak? Well, in terms of action, no. But in terms of morality, in terms of her belief system, in terms of holding true to the Labor Party values, yeah, I'd say Penny Wong's pretty weak. In fact, I'd say the Australian government is pretty weak. And we've just heard that Tony Burke now has made a secret deal with Nauru to deport people to Nauru. I mean, I can't believe it. It's almost like Bob Madasahatter is in charge of the government. And of course, speaking of weak, Bob came out recently, and that was interesting, wasn't it? That the guy whose parents come from Lebanon, he wanted to stand up and tell us why we don't want foreigners in this country because they're aggressive and don't listen to our laws, and then provided a glaring example of such himself. I would say he's a very weak man. And yet others would portray that as strength. See, this is the double standard with weakness. People who, like him, are right-wing xenophobic racists would say, well, he stood up for his point. He confronted the Nine News journalist, who, hats off, held his ground very well. But I would say it's quite weak to get that inflamed when someone asks you a question that you threaten to punch him in the face. I'd like you to try and threaten me like that, Bob. You'd be sitting on the ground spitting out your teeth. But that's another story. And I guess that makes me weak too, because I would respond to the idiot. Now, what's interesting is that the Australian government has prescribed the Iranian Republican Guard as a terrorist organisation. They had to amend the laws to do it because the way the laws were structured, you couldn't actually label a unit within a government like that as a terrorist organisation. But they've done that. They've altered the law and the definition of terrorist organisation. What I find very interesting is if the Iranian Republican Guard is a terrorist organisation, okay, why is not the IDF? Why hasn't our government, if it's not weak, why hasn't our government labelled the Israeli Defence Force, which has butchered civilians, killed paramedics, buried them in their ambulances in the middle of the desert to hide their war crimes? We have evidence of them throwing children alive into mass graves and burying them alive. Why aren't they a terrorist organisation? I haven't heard of the Republican Guard trying to wipe out the Jews in Iran. Iran, which, by the way, has the second largest Jewish population in the Middle East. There are over 1,000 synagogues in Iran. Funny, you don't hear that talked about on Sky News, do you? You don't hear a government discussing the fact that Jews are free to practice their religion in Iran. Iran, whilst it may not have the same amount of liberties and freedoms that we take for granted, is a very advanced country with a very, very high percentage of educated people. Interestingly enough, 56% of university graduates in Iran are women. Yes, even though they force them to wear their little headgear. Okay, now I'm not a fan of that, but women have a huge amount of freedoms in Iran. I saw a program many years ago on the ABC, when, of course, before we had to hate Iran, before you were taught to hate it, about an Iranian woman who was a doctor. She had a family and she graduated from university. She ran a practice. She drove a car. Just try doing one of those things, just one, in Saudi Arabia. And yet, we don't hear about Saudi Arabia being horrible and despotic, do we? Okay? The freedoms that you have in Iran as a woman far outweigh the freedoms that you have in many of the other Gulf states. And look at the way we frame people. I always laugh, North Korean dictator, because it's a hereditary dictatorship. Well, and so is the government of Saudi Arabia, only we call them a monarchy, not a dictatorship. But it's a hereditary rule passed down from, family through family generations with no chance to vote or to change that. What's the difference between North Korea and Saudi Arabia? And I guarantee you, and I've said this many times before, I guarantee you right now that women in North Korea have far more freedoms and civil liberties than women in Saudi Arabia. And yet, we're told to hate the North Koreans, and yet we're friends with the Saudis. Okay? But of course, that would be a sign of weakness, trying to appease Kim Jong, trying to talk to him. Okay, which once again, Trump was criticised for. And speaking of Trump, he is now showing his strength. He's not being weak, because he's deployed huge sections of the US military to the coast of Venezuela. Because, of course, the only way to stop drugs coming into America is to invade the country in South America, which has the largest oil reserves in the world. Now, isn't that an interesting coincidence? I thought it was Colombia where all the drugs were coming from, but apparently it's Venezuela, and we need to go and invade them. And at the same time, as another show of strength, not weakness, Marco Rubio has refused to allow the Palestinian delegations to attend the upcoming UN conference in New York. Wonderful, isn't it, when you can just have the United Nations where everyone is welcome except the people we don't want to be there. It's interesting. And at the upcoming September United Nations conference, we're going to have Al-Jilani, the unelected president of Syria, is going to address the UN. Now, isn't that amazing? A guy who is the head of a still proscribed terrorist organization is being feted and being welcomed to address the UN Assembly. Well, that's the state of the world. And we have in Europe, we have the Europeans now, behind Zelensky. We have Kaja Kallas, the foreign minister for the EU, once again an unelected position, telling us how we need to keep fighting the Russians on a losing war. She actually came out recently and said she's proud that Europe trained 80,000 Ukrainian soldiers, all of whom are most likely dead, by the way. Ms. Kallas, I hope you're proud of your work of doing that. You've achieved nothing. Here's another example of weakness. If anyone attempts to talk to Putin, if anyone attempts to resolve the war diplomatically, it's seen as weak. They're seen as weak. Why? What is wrong with negotiating? What is wrong with, yes, appeasing? Appeasing doesn't mean giving in. It means accepting their demands. And if their demands are reasonable, which the Russians' demands quite frankly are, and I know that'll piss a lot of people off, but if that pisses you off, it's because you're stupid and you're uninformed and you don't understand what's happening in Ukraine, which is the Russians went in to stop the ethnic cleansing of Donbass by the Ukrainian army, of killing the ethnic Russians who live there. And since then, that charlatan, that Western puppet, that corrupt little scum Zelensky, who is ferreting off millions of dollars for himself, has just done the West's bidding in fighting a proxy war admitted, by that thing, that horrible thing, Boris Johnson, who actually came out and said, we're fighting a proxy war with Russia, and who allowed the war to continue, forced Zelensky to keep fighting when they could have ended it in 2022, but that would have been weak, and we don't want to be weak. Now, moving again closer to home, this week we had Linda Reynolds win her defamation case and get awarded over $300,000. I find it amazing that somebody who cleaned up an office after a rape took place and who then criticised the person who was raped has somehow come out of this as the victim and not the poor woman who was actually raped. The woman who was spoken nastily about is the one getting all the money and all the compensation. And I think looking at that whole issue with the Brittany Higgins case, one of the things that's been overlooked by everybody is the fact that Bruce Lehrmann said that after being out socialising and drinking with friends, he was just going back to the office just to have a whiskey, I believe was the term used. The question I've got, and the issue I have with this, apart from the fact that this poor woman was clearly raped, but the issue I have is, why are people wandering into Parliament House after being out on the piss just to have a few drinks and relax? Parliament House is not a bar. It's not a nightclub. It's not a place you take your floozy. It is the seat of government. It is a place where there should be a certain amount of decorum. And one thing that always annoys me about governments is they enact laws for you and me which they don't adhere to themselves. Ask yourself this. I used to be a train driver. I was not allowed to be intoxicated at work. I couldn't even bring alcohol to work. If I, say, bought a bottle of wine in the morning, I wanted to take it home and drink it in my own house. If I put it in my locker at work, that was against my code of conduct. I could be dismissed for that, for having alcohol at work. And yet, the politicians who enact these laws, they can go out, they can have a few beers with their mates and stumble back into Parliament House anytime they want for a few more drinkies. Well, why aren't they breath tested? I was randomly breath tested because I was making safety critical decisions. You're telling me that running a country doesn't involve making safety critical decisions? And yet these guys can do it half pissed, but you and I can't. I think that's one of the important things that's been overlooked. And speaking of, the double standards of politics, right now in Indonesia, there are huge protests going on, as you've probably heard. Essentially what happened in Indonesia was that they introduced a raft of new taxes at the same time as giving the people, the representatives in the House of Reps, a huge additional allowance, an out-of-home allowance for when they have to travel into Jakarta from regional provinces and pay for accommodation. And the allowance was 10 times the average wage. So they're getting 10 times a month what the average Indonesian earns a month. And it's caused huge outcry because there's a lot of people losing their jobs in Indonesia. There's a big transfer of people from the middle class falling into the lower class. They're economically struggling. And so to compensate for this loss of middle class tax revenue or expenditure, which is a big part, it's about 54% of the Indonesian economy comes from the middle class and their spending habits, they've decided to tax the poor. So the street vendors, the people you see with little stalls by the side of the street, are suddenly getting taxed now. And of course, that was introduced at the same time as the government handed themselves a huge perk. And it caused mass outrage. And unfortunately, some people have now died as a result of the protests, and the protests are getting worse. And it's an example, once again, of what we see throughout the world. And we see it here, just not in the same extreme, but we see it throughout the world, of the double standards of how politicians and the wealthy live and how the tax burden is always placed on the poor, and those less able to pay tax are the ones who pay more tax. And we're the same here. We know recently of the issues with companies like Santos. They're paying no tax. They're getting all that gas. They're exporting it. They're making billions of dollars. And who's funding it all? Who's the ones that are providing the burden of actually funding the running of the country? It's you and me. It's the average person. So once again, we see the disparity in the world at large. So, finishing up on that, I guess we can say that we've looked at weakness. There is no definitive answer because weakness is a perceptual thing. What I perceive as weak, you may perceive as strength. What I perceive as strength, you may perceive as weakness. But I would caution that to talk the way that people are always put out there as being weak when they're trying to achieve something other than conflict, other than aggression. We don't always have to be strong. We don't always have to be an in-your-face Bob Madasahatter. It's okay to talk. It's okay to look for alternatives. And unfortunately, our Prime Minister has shown his weakness. I mean, if he wanted to be strong, why isn't he asking Israel to explain what happened to, say, Zomi Francom? Remember the Australian World Food Kitchen volunteer who was killed in an Israeli airstrike by the Israeli Air Force? Our Foreign Minister Penny Neverwong. It's interesting. She lied in Parliament. Now, here's a woman who censured Maureen Faruqi for holding up a sign, yet Penny Wong got up and said that we don't contribute in any way to Israel's military program. We don't have any ties with it, whilst full well knowing that we produce parts for the F-35 fighter, which Israel is using to bomb civilians. And in fact, we're the only country in the world that produces those parts under the global F-35 program. Now, why isn't Penny Neverwong being censured for lying in Parliament? It's a sad, sad world. Anyway, I'd like to wish you all the best for the weekend. Commiserations and thoughts with the poor people of Gaza who are being now systematically starved to death. I saw a great comment that said that at the moment a Jewish Prime Minister and a Christian President are starving 2 million people to death, and yet you expect me to be scared of Muslims. Satire. It's a wonderful way of telling the truth, isn't it? So, Bintang Bernie signing off for the weekend, reminding you there are two types of people in this world. Make damn sure you avoid them both.
And if you don't like it, then leave. Or use your right to protest down the street. Use your right, but don't imagine that it's